She raised him, sacrificed everything, and loved him unconditionally, until the day he and his wife turned that love into cruelty. Humiliated, dismissed, and treated like a burden, she vanished from their lives. But she didn't disappear to escape. She vanished to plan. And what she returned with wasn't forgiveness. It was a lesson that would make them pay the full price for their cruelty. This is the story of one mother's dark, emotional, and vengeful journey. The story of the price of her tears. Before we jump into the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. It really helps. The wind outside moaned through the naked trees, dragging dead leaves across the cracked driveway of a small, two-story house in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The place looked tired, like it hadn't laughed in years. Inside, Margaret Holloway stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm water that had long since gone cold. She wasn't washing dishes anymore. She was just staring through the small window, lost in the fog of her thoughts. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, painting the kitchen in faded gold. On the counter sat a half-empty cup of coffee and a folded grocery receipt. Her son's handwriting sprawled across the back. "Mum, next time, get generic. Don't waste money on brand stuff. We're not rich. Paul." Margaret's lips trembled faintly. She wasn't sure which hurt more, the words themselves or the tone she could hear behind them. Paul had always been her world. After her husband died in a car accident 15 years ago, she'd poured every ounce of her strength into raising their only child. She worked double shifts at the diner, scrimped and saved to send him to college, and told herself the exhaustion was worth it because someday Paul would have a better life. And he did. At 35, Paul Holloway was a real estate agent with a nice SUV and a picture-perfect wife, Lauren, who managed a small but upscale interior design firm. They lived in this house, Margaret's house, the one her late husband had built brick by brick. When she fell ill 2 years ago and couldn't maintain it, Paul convinced her to move back in with them. "It'll be easier for you, Mum," he'd said. And for a while, she'd believed him. Now the house didn't feel like hers anymore. The kitchen, once scented with cinnamon and coffee, smelled of disinfectant and artificial lavender. The walls she'd painted sky blue decades ago had been repainted white. Modern, Lauren called it. The family photos that once lined the hallway had been taken down, replaced with abstract art. Even her late husband's armchair had vanished one morning. When Margaret asked where it had gone, Lauren smiled tightly and said, "It didn't fit the aesthetic, Margaret. I donated it." She'd said Margaret, never Mom. Margaret blinked, her reflection faintly visible in the window. Her eyes were weary, her skin pale, her hands lined with years of labor. There was something haunted in her face, something that wasn't there before. The front door slammed open. Paul's voice echoed through the hallway. "Mom, did you take the car again this morning?" She turned, startled. "Yes, I just went to the pharmacy." You left the gas light on again," he snapped. "Do you know how expensive gas is right now?" Lauren followed him in, dressed in a beige coat, her expression carefully neutral. She looked at Margaret like she was a poorly chosen piece of furniture, something tolerated but regretted. "It's not a big deal, Paul," Lauren said softly. "I'll fill it up." We don't need to stress her. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes weren't. Margaret tried to smile. "I'm sorry, dear. I didn't realize—" "You never realize," Paul interrupted. "You leave lights on, you forget groceries, you take my car without asking. Lauren and I are trying to build a life here, And it's like you don't even care. There it was again, that phrase. Build a life. As if hers was already over. She lowered her gaze. I'll try to be more careful. Paul sighed, rubbing his temples. You always say that. Lauren stepped closer, her perfume sharp and citrusy. Paul, we talked about this. Maybe it's time to consider assisted living for her. Margaret's stomach twisted. Paul frowned. Lauren? I'm just saying, Lauren continued. You work all day, and I've got clients constantly. Your mother's alone here most of the time. She could have company, care, medical help. I don't need help, Margaret said quietly. Lauren's smile tightened. Everyone says that at first. Paul looked away, avoiding his mother's eyes. Something inside Margaret broke a little more. That night, she sat alone in her small bedroom, formerly the laundry room, staring at the photograph she'd kept hidden in her nightstand. It was old and slightly crumpled. Paul, at age 10, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling, their faces sunlit with joy. She traced his face with her trembling fingers. What happened to you, my boy? Her phone buzzed on the dresser, a text from Paul. Paul, don't forget, Lauren's parents are visiting tomorrow. Try to stay upstairs, okay? It's just easier that way. She stared at the message until the screen went dark. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she whispered, almost to herself. The next morning came heavy with rain. It clattered against the windows like impatient fingers, blurring the world beyond. The sound filled the small house, seeping into every room, every thought. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, dressed in the same worn cardigan she'd knitted years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned it. Her joints ached, a dull echo of the years she'd spent waiting tables, carrying trays heavier than she should have. Downstairs, laughter floated up, the crisp, polite kind that didn't belong to her world anymore. Lauren's parents had arrived. She could hear Lauren's voice, cheerful and calculated, the perfect hostess. Oh, it's just temporary having her here, Lauren was saying. You know how it is. We've been looking at some really nice assisted living communities nearby. They have activities and everything, laughter again. Margaret's stomach tightened. She stood by the bedroom door, listening. Guilt, battling humiliation. She wasn't meant to hear, but they hadn't even tried to lower their voices. It must be hard, honey, said Lauren's mother, a woman whose tone carried the kind of sympathy that was worse than cruelty. Having an elderly parent underfoot, especially when you're so young and busy. Lauren sighed theatrically. We manage, but it's a lot. She forgets things, you know. Sometimes she even leaves the stove on. It's scary. That was a lie. Margaret had never once left the stove on. Something in her chest burned. A quiet, controlled fire that had nowhere to go. She sat down again, her heart hammering softly against her ribs, and whispered to herself, maybe it's time they remember who I am. The day stretched long. Margaret stayed upstairs, as instructed, but the laughter below cut through her walls like glass. Every burst of it chipped away another piece of her restraint. When evening came, the guests finally left. She heard the sound of the front door closing, followed by silence and the faint hum of the dishwasher. Margaret waited a few minutes before stepping into the hallway. Paul was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. Lauren was pouring herself wine. The scent of expensive takeout filled the air, Italian, rich, and buttery. Did you eat, Mum? Paul asked absently, not looking up. I had soup. Good. We brought dinner for us, but there's leftovers if you want some later. Thank you, she said, though her stomach growled softly. Lauren's phone buzzed, and she smiled faintly. Oh, it's about the condo listing. You should check it, Paul. The one on Oak Ridge Avenue. We could make a killing if it sells. Margaret froze. Oak Ridge Avenue. That was her neighborhood, her old house, the one she'd signed over to Paul temporarily to help him secure a business loan. Her pulse quickened. You're selling it? She asked softly. Paul blinked, as if surprised she'd spoken. Oh, yeah, we're putting it on the market. It doesn't make sense to keep paying taxes on an empty property. Her throat tightened. But that was your father's house. Your home, I thought. Mom, Paul interrupted, his tone sharp now. We talked about this. It's mine legally. I'll handle it. Lauren smirked faintly into her wineglass. Margaret looked between them, her son, her daughter-in-law, and felt something inside her go still. It wasn't grief this time. It was clarity. They had taken everything, her home, her dignity, even the right to exist quietly in the house she once built with love. She turned and went upstairs without another word. That night, the storm broke. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the windows. Rain lashed the glass, turning the world outside into a blur of silver. Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by the small window, wrapped in a blanket, her mind circling one thought again and again. They will never learn unless I teach them. She didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. She wanted understanding, consequence. She wanted them to feel, even for a single day, what it meant to be dismissed, unappreciated, unwanted. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted them to regret every cruel word they'd thrown her way. The idea came slowly, like a whisper in the dark. Her late husband, Thomas, had left her something, a small insurance payout she'd never told Paul about. It wasn't much, but it had grown quietly over the years in a separate account, enough to start over if she wanted to. She thought of that account now, and of the old house they were planning to sell. If they wanted to erase her from their lives, she'd give them exactly that, on her terms. The next morning, Margaret rose early before dawn. She cooked breakfast for them, pancakes, eggs, bacon, just like she used to when Paul was a child. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and nostalgic. When Lauren came down, she blinked in surprise. Wow, you're up early. Margaret smiled faintly. I thought I'd do something nice. It's been a long week. Paul appeared soon after, tie half done, looking distracted. He stopped at the sight of the food. You didn't have to, Mom. I wanted to, she said softly. You both work so hard. They ate. Margaret didn't join them. She just poured coffee and listened. Lauren talked about her design projects, Paul about his listings. Neither asked about her day. When they left, Margaret stood at the window, watching their car pull out of the driveway. The moment the tail lights vanished, she turned toward the kitchen table where her old laptop sat. She opened it, logged in, and began searching. Assisted living facilities, property deeds, transfer records, private listings. Hours passed. Rain turned to sun. By the time they returned home that evening, Margaret had a folder of papers tucked neatly into her drawer, and a quiet, dangerous calm about her. That weekend, she asked Paul for a favor. Could you drive me to my old house? She asked gently. I'd like to see it before it sells. He hesitated. I don't know, Mum. Buyers might be coming soon. Lauren frowned. What's the point, Margaret? It's just a house. It's not just a house, Margaret said quietly. It's my memories. For a second, Paul looked guilty. Then he sighed. Fine. Tomorrow morning. The next day was bright and clear, the skies scrubbed clean after the storm. The Oak Ridge house stood at the end of a quiet street, white shutters gleaming, the porch freshly painted by the real estate team. Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the sight. The maple tree in the yard had grown taller. The swing Thomas built for Paul still hung from one branch, though weathered and cracked. She reached out and touched it, her throat tightening. Paul stood nearby, checking his phone again. You ready to go, Mum? She nodded. Just a few minutes. While he paced on a call, Margaret slipped toward the backyard. Her eyes scanned the garden, overgrown now, but familiar. She knelt beside the old rosebush and brushed away the dirt until her fingers hit metal. A small, rusted box. She'd buried it there years ago, after Thomas's funeral. Inside were documents. Thomas's will, letters, and one envelope containing a key and a single note in his handwriting. For when you need to remind them who built this family. Tears welled in her eyes. She closed the box, clutching it tightly. Paul didn't notice as she walked back toward the car, her expression calm but unreadable. That night, she sat at her desk again, the box open beside her. She reread Thomas's words until her tears dried into resolve. They thought she was weak. They thought her silence was surrender. They were about to learn that her silence had simply been the... 3 days later, Cedar Falls woke to another quiet morning. The air was crisp, and the smell of autumn, damp leaves, wood smoke, and fading warmth hung in the streets. Inside the Holloway house, Margaret was no longer the timid, apologetic woman who once crept through her own home. Her movements were deliberate, calm, precise. Every glance, every word, every breath had purpose now. Paul and Lauren didn't notice the change. They never did. At breakfast, Margaret served them coffee and toast like always. Paul barely looked up from his phone. Lauren was too busy planning a design project for a new client. A high-end renovation for the mayor's cousin, she'd said. Big money on this one, Lauren murmured, scrolling through her tablet. If this goes well, I'll finally get the media feature I deserve. You mean we deserve? Paul corrected with a smirk. That's still our business account, remember? Lauren didn't answer. She just sipped her coffee and smiled a little too sweetly. Margaret watched them quietly, her mind working behind her calm expression. Paul, she said softly, I noticed the for sale sign isn't up at the Oak Ridge house yet. He frowned, suspicious. Why are you asking? I thought you said it was ready to list. It is, he said quickly. Paperwork just needs a few signatures. Why? Margaret nodded. No reason. I just wondered. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made Paul uneasy, without knowing why. Later that day, when they both left for work, Margaret retrieved the rusted metal box from her drawer again. Inside were the old documents from Thomas, deeds, policies, and one that mattered most, the original property deed for the Oak Ridge house. What Paul didn't know was that the title transfer he'd pushed her into years ago was never completed. The lawyer handling the paperwork had died unexpectedly, and the final registration had stalled. Margaret, grieving and confused at the time, never followed up, but neither had Paul. He assumed ownership without checking, and now that oversight was about to cost him everything. Margaret spent the entire afternoon contacting a local attorney she'd known for decades, Ellen Brewster, who'd quietly handled her husband's estate back in the day. Ellen remembered her immediately. Margaret Holloway! My goodness, it's been years. What can I do for you? Margaret's voice trembled with a mix of nerves and resolve. Ellen, I need to know exactly who owns the property on Oak Ridge Avenue. Ellen promised to check and call back within the hour. When the phone finally rang, Margaret's heart nearly stopped. Margaret, Ellen said slowly, I just reviewed the records. Your name is still on the deed. Paul's transfer never went through silence. Then a slow, quiet breath. So it's still mine, Margaret whispered. Legally, yes. But if you want to protect it, you'll need to act fast before he files anything else. Margaret nodded, her fingers trembling slightly. Then I think it's time to sell it myself. That night, when Paul and Lauren came home, she greeted them with tea and polite small talk. Nothing in her demeanour hinted that the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. Lauren, oblivious, was bragging about a new social media campaign for her business. We're going to be huge, Paul. I just know it. I might even hire an assistant soon. Paul grinned. Good. Maybe you can finally stop making me do all your bookkeeping. Margaret smiled thinly. Sounds like everything's going perfectly for you both. Lauren laughed. Almost. Once we sell that old house, we'll be set for the rest of the year. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, her spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. Oh, I wouldn't be too sure, she murmured. What's that supposed to mean? Paul asked. Margaret looked up, her eyes calm. Nothing, dear. Just, you never know what tomorrow brings. They both chuckled dismissively, but the words hung in the air long after she'd gone upstairs. The next morning, Margaret went to meet Ellen in person. The lawyer's small office smelled of old books and polished wood. Ellen slid a folder across the desk. Here are the updated ownership documents. You can sell it if you wish. But are you sure, Margaret? That house means a lot to you. Margaret nodded slowly. It used to. But it's just bricks now. I'd rather turn it into something that matters. You mean revenge? Ellen asked, half smiling. Margaret met her eyes. I mean peace. Within a week, the Oak Ridge house was listed, quietly, under Margaret's maiden name. She found a buyer almost immediately, a local couple looking to open a small bed and breakfast. They paid in full, and within days, the funds were transferred to Margaret's account. The sum was substantial. Combined with her hidden savings, it was enough for her next move. She began withdrawing in small amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, careful not to raise suspicion. She opened a new account under a trust name that Paul couldn't trace. The Holloway Foundation. The irony made her smile. One evening, as Paul and Lauren sat watching TV, Margaret approached them. I've been thinking, she began softly, about what you said. Maybe it's time I moved out. Lauren's eyes lit up. Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful. I mean, if that's what you want, of course. Paul frowned. You sure? Where would you go? There's a lovely community centre across town, she said. A small apartment attached. Affordable? Peaceful. Paul hesitated. If you're sure. I am. Lauren clapped her hands once, smiling brightly. This is such a relief. I mean, that's great news. We'll help you pack. Margaret smiled faintly. No need. I'll handle everything a week later. She was gone. Her room was empty, her few possessions neatly packed away. On the nightstand, she left a single folded note. Thank you for everything. I hope you find peace in this house. Mom Paul found it the next morning and sighed. Well, I guess she finally did what's best for everyone. Lauren wrapped her arms around him. See? Things are working out. Now we can really start living. They didn't notice the quiet changes that followed, subtle things, creeping up like shadows. Their shared business account began receiving error notices. Bank transfers bounced back. Lauren's biggest client backed out suddenly. Paul's firm suspended him over a clerical discrepancy in his real estate license renewal. At first, they blamed coincidence, then panic. 2 weeks later, the truth hit like a hammer. Paul opened a letter from the bank, his face draining of colour. "Lauren," he said quietly, "did you know the Oak Ridge house sold?" Lauren blinked. "What? You mean the listing?" He handed her the document. "It's gone. It sold under Mum's name." Lauren stared at it, disbelief hardening into fury. "She can't do that. It's ours." Paul sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "It wasn't. Not legally." They searched for her, called, emailed, drove to every address they could think of. But Margaret Holloway had vanished like smoke. No forwarding address, no phone, nothing. The only clue arrived 3 days later in an unmarked envelope slid under their front door. Inside was a single photo, their wedding day, Margaret smiling beside them, her hand on Paul's shoulder. Across the bottom, written in neat, looping handwriting, were the words, "You taught me what love costs. Consider this the price of my tears." Paul's business collapsed within months. Without his license, his reputation was ruined. Lauren's design firm faltered too. Her biggest clients quietly dropped her after whispers spread about unethical billing practices. They lost the house soon after, forced to sell it to cover debts. And somewhere on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, in a cozy lakeside cottage bought under a new name, Margaret Holloway watched the sunset with a quiet smile. In her living room hung a single framed photo, her late husband, Thomas, holding baby Paul. She touched the glass and whispered, "You were right, my love. Sometimes they have to lose everything to learn the value of what they had." The wind outside carried the faintest sound of rain. Soft. The winter came early that year. Cedar Falls lay under a cold grey sky, the kind that turned breath into fog and streets into mirrors of slush. Paul Holloway sat alone in the corner of a nearly empty diner, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The man who once walked with an easy, confident stride now looked hollowed out, eyes bloodshot, jaw unshaven, suit 2 years out of date. The waitress passed by, gave him a look of tired sympathy, and refilled his cup. He murmured a thank you, then rubbed his temples. He was 40 now. 40, broke, and barely scraping by doing side jobs, paperwork for another agent who didn't know his license had been suspended indefinitely. Lauren had left 6 months earlier. She'd packed her designer clothes, her laptop, and her pride, and vanished after a final screaming match that ended with her shouting, "Your mother ruined us, Paul." She took everything. Paul didn't argue. Somewhere deep down, he knew she was right, but not in the way she meant. He had ruined himself the moment he forgot who had given him everything. Now, with his debts piling and his name blacklisted in half the county, he found himself haunted by the memory of his mother's quiet eyes and that last note she left behind. "Consider this the price of my tears." He had thought she meant money. Now he understood she meant peace. And peace was something he hadn't known in years. That night, Snow began to fall. Paul drove through it slowly, headlights catching the flakes as they drifted like ghosts. He wasn't sure why he took the back roads. Maybe he just needed to see the lake again, the place he used to go fishing with his father, where his mother would pack sandwiches and sit on the pier, humming softly. When he reached the familiar dirt road, his breath caught. There, through the veil of snow, a small cottage glowed with golden light. Smoke curled from its chimney, and through the window, he saw her, Margaret, alive, calm, reading by the fire. For a long moment, he sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering, like a child caught in a lie. Then he stepped out. The snow crunched beneath his boots. The air burned cold in his lungs. When he knocked, the door opened almost instantly. She looked at him, and time seemed to stop. Her hair had gone whiter, but her eyes were sharp, clear and steady, the eyes of someone who'd made peace with every ghost. "Paul," she said softly, "you look cold." He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Mom? I didn't know you were here." "You didn't look very hard." He flinched. I thought you were gone." "I tried to find you, did you?" Silence. He stepped inside slowly. The warmth hit him like a memory. Wood fire, cinnamon, faint lavender. Everything smelled like home. He looked around. The cottage was modest, but beautiful. Hand-woven blankets, soft light, plants thriving near the windows, a life rebuilt with patience and dignity. "You look good," he said awkwardly. "Better than I did before," she replied. "Sit down, Paul." He obeyed, sinking into a chair near the fire. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of burning wood. Then she said, quietly, "Why are you here?" He swallowed hard. "Because I can't stop thinking about what I did to you." Her gaze didn't soften. "And what exactly did you do to me?" He looked down. "I treated you like a burden. I forgot what you gave up for me. I let Lauren talk me into things I knew were wrong. I sold your house, your memories, your peace. I—" His voice broke. "I was a terrible son." Margaret stared into the fire for a moment, then said, "No, Paul. You were a selfish one. There's a difference. Selfishness can be unlearned. Cruelty cannot." He nodded, eyes burning. "I know. I've been paying for it ever since." "Yes," she said softly. "You have." Paul reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I don't have much," he said. "But I want you to have this. It's what's left from the house sale, after the debts. It's not enough. But—" She shook her head. "Keep it. Money was never what I wanted." "Then why?" he whispered. "Why do all of this? Why take everything?" She turned to him, her voice calm but cold as the snow outside. "Because you needed to understand what it feels like to lose everything that gives your life meaning. That was the only way you'd learn the weight of another person's pain." Her words struck like a slap. He nodded slowly, tears sliding down his cheeks. "You were right." Margaret sighed, a sound of weariness more than victory. "Revenge doesn't heal, Paul. It just resets the balance. I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it to give you a chance to start again, without arrogance, without cruelty. Just as I had to." He looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" She rose from her chair and walked to a small writing desk by the window. From a drawer, she took out a thin folder and set it in front of him. "It's called the Holloway Foundation," she said. "I used the money from the sale to create a fund. For families like ours. For single mothers. For sons who've lost their way. For people who need a second chance. It's legally yours now." Paul blinked. "Mine?" I've set it up in your name. You'll manage it. Help people the way I once tried to help you. He stared at her, bewildered. Why would you trust me with that after everything? She looked at him steadily. Because you're still my son. And every mother hopes her child can change Paul. Left the cottage that night, with snow crunching underfoot and a different kind of weight pressing on his shoulders. Not guilt, responsibility. He didn't deserve forgiveness, but she had given him something harder, a task. And in time, he took it seriously. Months passed. Spring thawed the snow, and Paul began volunteering at a local shelter, using the foundation funds to renovate old buildings and sponsor families in need. He worked quietly, without praise, and every time he handed someone a set of keys or wrote a check, he remembered his mother's voice. They have to lose everything to learn what they had. One afternoon, nearly a year later, Paul received a letter in handwriting he recognized instantly. Dear Paul, if you're reading this, I've gone to rest beside your father. Do not grieve. I've had peace for a long time now, and I found joy knowing you finally understood what love costs and what it's worth. You were my greatest pain and my greatest pride. Remember that redemption is not an end, but a choice you must make every day. Live kindly, son. That is the only revenge worth keeping. Mom Paul read the letter twice, then folded it gently and slipped it into his wallet. He drove out to the lake again, to the cottage that now sat empty, and placed a bouquet of white roses by the door. As the wind rustled through the trees, he whispered, You taught me the price of your tears, Mom. I'll spend the rest of my life paying it forward. He looked out over the still water, the sky burning orange with sunset. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Quietly, sadly. Months later, the Holloway Foundation became a community fixture. People in Cedar Falls began to whisper stories about a mysterious older woman who once helped fund it, and her son who worked tirelessly to honor her legacy. No one knew her full story, but they didn't need to. They just knew that somewhere, in the unseen balance between grief and grace, justice had found its way home. And if you passed by the lakeside cottage on a still autumn evening, you might see a single light flickering inside, like a candle kept burning for forgiveness.